Brian Stelter reporting that for a second day, the White House has barred the Associated Press, one of the largest news organizations in the world, from entering the Oval Office during a press conference. So enjoy presidents deciding access based on compliance with the words that they like. It is a horrible new standard, and everyone applauding it is going to hate it soon enough.
This video is both an update to a specific story that we covered yesterday and the broader pattern of the Trump administration's war against media that they don't like. Specifically, for the second day in a row, the Trump administration is censoring the Associated Press, denying them White House access because they won't use language that Donald Trump personally likes. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, this is some pretty stunning stuff. We're going to start, we might even play the whole thing, this segment by Jake Tapper of CNN discussing what the Trump administration is doing to his colleagues, peers, and rivals over at the Associated Press.
CNN's Brian Stelter reporting that for a second day, the White House has barred the Associated Press, one of the largest news organizations in the world, from entering the Oval Office during a press conference. This time, it was for the swearing in of Tulsi Gabbard as the Director of National Intelligence, followed by Trump's remarks. We're going to have more on why in a moment, but travel back in time with me to 2022 when candidate Donald Trump said this about the importance in this nation of free speech.
If we don't have free speech, then we just don't have a free country. It's as simple as that.
Last month, on his first day in office, President Trump signed a wave of executive orders, including one called Restoring Freedom of Speech and Ending Federal Censorship. It said, among other things, quote, government censorship of speech is intolerable in a free society, unquote. The same day, President Trump signed another order renaming the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America. And that order is what brings us back to this week. And the initial reason the Associated Press was blocked, the reporter was blocked from entering the Oval Office yesterday because while the United States government now recognizes the new name, the Gulf of America, and the Gulf of America now shows up on Google Maps, which goes by what the U.S. calls things, Mexico and other countries have not recognized the name change, and that leads the Associated Press to issue this style guidance, quote, the Gulf of Mexico has carried that name for more than 400 years. The Associated Press will refer to it by its original name while acknowledging the new name Trump has chosen, unquote. Sort of like how for a while everyone was still calling X, the platform formerly known as Twitter. Maybe. Anyway, the executive editor of the AP says it was told by the White House yesterday, get on board with our name change or your reporters cannot come to the executive order signing in the Oval Office. And
so let's stop right there. And again, just because, again, this is an update to a story we'll get to. I just want to remind you that even libertarian free speech organizations like FIRE, who, by the way, have gone after Democrats time and time again, it's not like there's some sort of liberal partisan network that goes after Republicans. They are equal opportunity critics. They also condemn this. Punishing journalists for not adapting state-mandated terminology is an alarming attack on press freedom. That's viewpoint discrimination, and it's unconstitutional. Donald Trump has the authority to change how the U.S. government refers to the Gulf, but he can't punish a news organization for using another term. The role of our free press is to hold those in power accountable, not to act as their mouthpiece. Any government efforts to erode this fundamental freedom deserve condemnation. And again, it was so bad that, as I mentioned in yesterday's video, even legendary pro-Republican, pro-conservative Fox News analyst Brit Hume publicly co-signed what FIRE's statement was with an I agree. Even Brit Hume is like, this is a bridge too far. And it is. It really is. I'll also remind you that Donald Trump's press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, was confronted about this by Caitlin Collins at CNN, Jake Tapper's co-host, or rather colleague. And this was the defiant, censorious response from Trump's White House.
That is given. And there are hundreds of outlets on this campus. Many of you in this room who don't have the privilege of being part of that pool every single day and getting to ask the president questions. We reserve the right to decide who gets to go into the Oval Office. And you all have credentials to be here, including the Associated Press, who is in this briefing room today.
But isn't it retaliatory in nature is the argument, because the reason that the AP was barred, which they said was because they're not using the phrase Gulf of America, they're using Gulf of Mexico in line with with their standards. And so the question here is this setting a precedent that this White House will retaliate against reporters who don't use the language that you guys believe reporters should use? And how does that align with the First Amendment commitment that you were just talking about?
I was very upfront in my briefing on day one that if we feel that there are lies being pushed by outlets in this room, we are going to hold those lies accountable. And it is
Right. So they will engage in acts of censorship if they don't like what the media is reporting. If they feel that you are not using the terminology that Donald Trump personally demands because of his vanity project renaming the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, then you will be punished and your access to the White House be restricted as a consequence. Now, their argument is we have the right to filter out access to the White House. And to some extent, that's true, right? Not just anybody can walk into the White House. You have to get credentialed. You have to pass Secret Service guarantees. But the Associated Press has their credentials. And the only reason they're being kept out is because Trump is pissed at them over the Gulf of Mexico versus Gulf of America. It's not like it was random. It's not like they said, hey, listen, we have finite space here, so we're just going to pull straws and, oh my God, the Associated Press. They were targeted specifically over this name change issue. That's very censorious and petty. But we will continue with Jake Tapper.
This was that signing that the AP reporter was barred from, where the owner of X, Elon Musk, a self-described free speech absolutist, stood behind the Resolute desk answering questions about DOGE and the dismantling of huge swaths of the federal government without any apparent oversight. The White House, of course, was word policing and punishing the AP. Thus, none of those questions came from the AP, which boasts that 2.6 billion people see its news every year. CNN's Caitlin Collins.
And he's going to play the clip that we just played of Caitlin Collins, so we'll skip past that because we just covered it.
This is a chilling effect. It's not really about whatever the AP wants to call the Gulf. It's about whether a president should punish reporters because they're not doing what he wants and not calling things what he wants. And again, this can swing both ways. Back in 2021, the Biden administration's official position, wrongly, was that there was no migrant crisis at the border. A White House official told CNN back then, quote, children coming to our border seeking refuge from violence, economic hardships, and other dire circumstances is not a crisis, unquote. But we in the news media here at CNN, we have eyes and ears, and we called it a crisis because it was a crisis. Would it have been okay for the Biden White House to not allow CNN reporters into the Oval Office because of that? No. Will it be okay with the MAGA movement if future President Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez bans news outlets from entering the Oval Office because they don't use her terminology for whatever issue? Trans Americans, farmers, the border crisis, whatever. And to extend it further, what about Mr. Trump's attempts to unilaterally gut federal agencies or get rid of them without even talking to Congress, such as USAID, or what he wants to do with the Department of Education, or his efforts to render them officially impotent, as is happening right now with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau? What if a Democratic president in the future decides she's going to do the same thing? She's just unilaterally going to not recognize and dismantle ICE. I mean, what if that happens? These standards, they get eroded. And anybody who's lived in Washington knows when the standards are eroded, whether it has to do with pardons or filibuster exemptions or executive actions, they never come back. They just don't. So enjoy presidents deciding access based on compliance with the words that they like. It is a horrible new standard, and everyone applauding it is going to hate it soon enough.
And Democrats should absolutely make the people cheerleading it now feel the pain when they're back in power. Here's the thing. Standards and norms require reciprocity. They do. It's not like the law. See, in the law, like if somebody commits a crime, that doesn't give you permission or license or justification to commit the same crime, right? But norms fundamentally, inherently require reciprocity, right? Because if you don't have reciprocity, it's not a norm. By definition, it must be reciprocated. And if the freedom of speech or access, rather specifically, access to the White House is going to be predicated not on just a general notion of, hey, listen, conservative, liberal, Republican, or Democrat, we should just try to maximally offer as much access to the White House as possible. If that's not going to be the norm, then Democrats have an obligation, I would argue, when they're in power, to teach the Republicans a lesson. Because if you don't, the lesson that the Republicans will learn is not only can they do this, they can actually do it with impunity because Republicans or Democrats won't retaliate. And so I think it's actually an interesting point made by Jake Tapper is, again, imagine if the shoe were on the other foot. Consider, I mentioned Fox News because Brit Hume took a principled stance here saying this was wrong. Could have been more harsh when he said it. He would be more persistent. I doubt Fox is going to stand up for the Associated Press. But imagine if President Biden had said, Fox, you had to pay $787 million to Dominion Voting Systems in the single biggest defamation settlement in the history of this country because you knowingly signal boosted Donald Trump's lies about the 2020 election when he just simply got his ass kicked in a free and fair election. That is an unprecedented level of dishonesty and corruption, the likes of which we've never seen from CNN or MSNBC. You all are inferior morally as a consequence, and therefore I'm denying you access based on the threat you pose to free and fair elections given your reach and your influence and your unparalleled dishonesty. How would MAGA have responded? How would Trump have responded? How would Caroline Leavitt have responded? How would elected Republicans have responded? They would have been rightly upset. But unfortunately, too many in conservative media are cheerleading this. But this is an act of censorship. And it doesn't stand by itself. There are other acts of censorship going on, as we've discussed. But I just wanted to point this out that once again, we have confirmation that for the second day, it wasn't even a fluke. It would have been bad enough if it had just been one day. But the White House is continuing to ban and limit access to the Oval Office against the Associated Press in particular over words. In the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments.